Hi there. In this episode, the most influential keyboards to date. I say to date because I keep hoping that manufacturers will come up with something earth-shattering. Personally, and to a degree, I hate lists like this. Sometimes these lists are just a person's favorite keyboards. That's not the case here, even though I do love some of these keyboards. Other times it seems like the person put the list together just to see how many people they can upset. And I assure you, that is not my intent either. The list is going to be different because it's actually going to be two lists. The first list is going to be a list of the most influential keyboards. I'm going to rate that influence on a scale of 0 to 100. Anything rated from 0 to 50, I will consider as having a minor influence, but more influence as it approaches 50. Similarly, anything rated from 51 to 100, I will consider as having a major influence, but even more influence as it approaches 100. Let me define what I mean by influential. It includes the following two elements. A keyboard could have one or both of these elements. It must advance the technical state of the art. That would be element number one. It must advance the sonic state of the art. That would be element number two. To be influential, it has to do at least one of them in a meaningful way. I will give you some specs for the keyboards, but moreover, I will tell you why it made the list in concrete terms. The second list will include many notable keyboards that didn't make the list because they wouldn't even rate a 1 on the list of the most influential keyboards, at least as far as I'm concerned. For each of these keyboards, I will tell you why it didn't make the list, and once again, in concrete terms. A few items I'm going to talk about in general terms. When I start the list, you should understand why that is the case. As the list progresses, I will get more specific. Here we go. First on the list, the pipe organ or hydraulic organ. It is credited with coming into existence perhaps as early as 300 BC. It is better known for appearing in churches around the 900s. It was a large instrument requiring a large building and usually commanding an audience. Other than rich royalty of the time, few people could own a pipe organ, but many churches had money for such an instrument. From this sprung up choirs to present prayer and song. Influential score, 85. Next, we have to wait for the 1400s to find our next influential instrument, the harpsichord. You may not have heard of Giovanni Pisci, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, who is famous for his works on the harpsichord, but you've probably heard of Johann Sebastian Bach. I've never been much of a fan of harpsichord, even though Bach is in my top 3 favorite classical composers. Unlike a piano, the strings are plucked, not hammered. Also, unlike the pipe organ, the harpsichord was getting to a size that was almost portable, even for a time when horse and cart was a basic mode of transportation. Influential score, 45. It's a minor influencer, but towards the top of the scale because it introduces a major influencer. Next, the piano. The piano came on the scene circa 1700 and is credited to Bartolomeo Cristofori, 1655 to 1731. I listed his birth dates there and his date of death because he lived a long lifespan for that time period. Early pianos had fewer than 88 notes. Some had 54, which is way less than our popular size today of 61 notes, also known as 5 octaves. These pianos are said to have a sound that is closer to a harpsichord rather than a modern piano. This was due to thinner strings and harder hammers. 3 of Cristofori's pianos survive in museums. I'd love an opportunity to play one of those pianos. One big advantage of the piano over the harpsichord was dynamics. A harpsichord of that time could not respond to a player's touch. A piano could. Modernly, almost every type of music has used piano. Classical, ragtime, jazz, blues, country, rock, hip-hop, ska, reggae, gospel, and so on. It also makes a great solo instrument, which can't be said for all instruments. Influential score? I had no doubt about this. Feel free to disagree if you want. I give the piano a score of 100. Next, 1935, the Hammond organ, invented by Lawrence Hammond and John Hannert. Up until 1975, tone wheel models were produced. In 1967, transistor models became available. Digital models came out around 1985. The Hammond organ was almost portable, or at least as portable as a piano. It's impossible to talk about the Hammond organ and not talk about the Leslie. The Leslie is a part of the sound of the Hammond. Donald Leslie invented what we call the Leslie speaker. People often call it a rotating speaker sound, which is pretty accurate. Just be aware that the speakers don't actually rotate. The history. Okay, so from what I remember, Donald Leslie purchased a Hammond organ and he took it home and he was a little bit disappointed because he was hoping he was going to get a church organ sound. He wanted something more, and because of that, he developed what we call as the rotating speaker sound. By 1940, he had perfected that, and he goes and he visits Hammond, and he offers it, said, you should sell these two as a pair. And Hammond basically kicks him out and says, my instrument's perfect, I don't need your crappy speaker. But as we know, people like the rotating speaker sound of the Leslie. That's pretty much the history of that. One thing about the Hammond you may not know is how prolific it is. If you were a small church that needed a pipe organ, you were probably unlikely to be able to afford one. A Hammond with a Leslie would work just fine. Hammond sold a lot of organs to churches. Manufacturers tend to keep sales a secret. However, we know that very popular modern keyboards have sold close to 300,000 units. The Hammond has sold over 2 million units. Now that's across a whole spectrum of models. The most popular model was the B3, produced from 1954 until 1974. That's a long lifespan for a specific model. Keyboards today don't usually have a manufacturing lifespan that long. Organ is ingrained in our culture and our music. It is synonymous with baseball, TV variety shows of yesteryear, early soap operas, and with jazz, gospel, country, rock, pop music, and many more. Pipe organs were available, but Hammond started a trend towards portability and a sound that blended well with the music that was coming of age. Jazz, pop, country, rock. They all benefited from the organ sound. Time to give it an influential score, and it gets two of them. The Hammond gets a 70. Add a Leslie, and it gets an 82. I believe it's that important. Next, the electric piano, also known famously as the Rhodes and Wurlitzer. Harold Burroughs Rhodes invented the first Rhodes in 1942. It was a fairly basic instrument with only 29 keys. Leo Fender acquired the company in 1959. In 1965, Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, one of our major broadcasters, acquired the instrument company. Shortly thereafter, the Rhodes suitcase and stage pianos started to be manufactured. The Wurlitzer came into production in 1954. The inventor, Benjamin Meisner, had been working on models since the 1930s. The Model 200 is the most popular model and was produced from 1968 to 1983. For early keyboardists, many venues had a house piano, but that still means that some didn't. For keyboardists of the 70s, both the Rhodes and the Whirly were portable instruments. Even if a piano was available at the venue, these electric piano instruments could be amplified and affected, bringing audiences a new genre of sounds. Coming up with an influential score was hard on this. I believe it has to be on the major side of the scale. This was a portable instrument for working keyboardists. Influential score, 65. If you think this is too high, I would definitely disagree. If you think it's too low, I might agree, but this is the value I have assigned it. Next, the Prophet 5. You might want to make sure you're sitting down when I'm discussing this instrument, because I'm not always going to be kind to it in some regard. If you ask a lot of people, they will tell you with authority that the Prophet 5 brought affordable polyphonic synthesizers to the masses. That's what I've heard over the years, and you may have heard it too. As far as the Prophet 5 being influential, I agree. It was the first polyphonic synthesizer with programmable memory. This was a technical, state-of-the-art advancement, meaning no patch cables, you can program sounds and record them at will. Originally 40 patches, then 120, and finally 200 patches on the Rev 4. As far as the statement that the Prophet 5 brought affordable polyphonic synthesizers to the masses, I disagree. I believe this has just become a statement that folks parrot and they associate it with the Prophet 5 because they've heard it a lot. You may have heard that the Prophet 5 was the first polyphonic synthesizer, but that's not true either. There were several others like the Oberheim 4-voice and the 8-voice. So the Prophet 5 does not get recognized for sonic advancement either. Let's analyze the Prophet 5 being an affordable synthesizer for the masses. In 1978, the Prophet 5 cost only $3,995. That was truly a bargain compared to modular synths. My Kronos X had a retail price close to that, but that was in 2011. $3,995 in today's money is a little over $19,000. Does that seem affordable for a 5-voice polyphonic analog synth today? Minimum wage in 1978 was $2.65. I worked all summer to afford my first polyphonic synth. That was a Roland Juno 106 in 1984 at a cost of $1,099. And I was making something like $4.65 an hour before I got a job later that summer playing in a band. I just don't think it's fair to say that the Prophet 5 was affordable to the masses. To rich folks and wealthy pro musicians, sure, but not for everyday folks. A brand new 1978 Ford Pinto 2-door sedan had a base price of $3,629. Its average retail was $3,325. That's way less than the Prophet 5. On the other hand, the Prophet 5 doesn't burst into flames when you rear-end it, so that's a plus. I'm giving the Prophet 5 an influential score of 80. Next, 1983. If you're a synth aficionado, you've got to know what's coming. And it's the Yamaha DX7 programmable digital synthesizer. I say it like that for a reason. I'll tell you why in a moment. This was a leap forward for musicians. Analog synthesizers were never very good at mimicking acoustic instruments. We all know that. In another episode, I talk about how I spent one afternoon programming dozens of sounds into my shiny new Juno 106, only to have my mother tell me they all sounded like an organ. Oh well. The DX7 was truly something new. From the moment I heard the demo flexi disc included in my keyboard magazine issue, I wanted a DX7. I remember how it starts, and I didn't look this up because I'm doing this from memory. We are proud to present the Yamaha DX7 and DX9 programmable digital synthesizers. Let the performance begin. And then it goes into this kind of classical Baroque thing. Porcaro and Paich, the two famous keyboard players from Toto, did some of the demos on that flexi disc. Great stuff. It's available on YouTube if you want to go find it. I was afraid to put it up here because I don't know if it would violate a copyright. Today we can chuckle a little at how the DX7 renditions of acoustic instruments are not that great. But back in 1983, they sounded pretty darn close compared to analog synthesizers. The EP, bass sounds, and others were on so many tracks back in the 80s. When MTV was a thing in the 80s, it was hard to find a keyboard rack in a music video that didn't include a DX7. If you wanted to look cool, you had to have a DX7 in your rack. But more than that, the DX7 was cool. It's still cool. One thing I truly admire about the DX7, compared to other synths of the 1980s, is that its capabilities haven't been blown out of proportion to all reason. The original DX7 had 32 patches, a cartridge slot, and MIDI was system exclusive. It had velocity, sensitivity, and channel aftertouch. It had flawed MIDI velocity implementation, but Gray Matter E took care of that. That was an upgrade. And it also gave you more of what made the DX7 great. In 1983, the list price was $1,995, and they were hard to find new. Keyboard Magazine had stories of folks like airline pilots bringing them in from Japan for musician friends that would use power converters to use them with US mains power. Early on, there was this whole gray market culture about buying the DX7 because they were hard to find. I was lucky enough to get my hands on one circa 1984. A band that was interested in me playing with them gave me theirs to learn a bunch of songs. It broke my heart to give it back, but they were 50 miles away from me and I couldn't see myself driving 100 miles round trip each night. I probably should have realized that earlier, but I was really enjoying the DX7. Sorry about that, guys. A very important specification of the DX7 is its 16-note polyphony. I can't think of any other portable synthesizer that had that much polyphony at the time. On the original DX7, you couldn't split the keyboard, but you could work miracles with keyboard scaling. The factory patch train sound is still amazing to this day. The Roland Jupiter 6 and Prophet 600 are credited with being the first keyboards with MIDI. But the DX7 came out the same year, and so it's not like Yamaha was late to the party. MIDI was a huge advancement, but this list is not about technological advancements. It's about specific keyboards. The DX7 is one of the most sought-after used keyboards. Luckily, sources state that over 160,000 were made, and that's also kept prices down. This includes the version 2 line introduced in 1987 that are 16-bit, includes split and dual options, more patch memory, a better screen, better buttons, better MIDI implementation, and even more features with a Gray Matter E upgrade. I'm a fan of the DX7 and its impact on music in the 80s and beyond, but I tried to keep that in check when assigning it an influential score. I'm giving it an influential score of 88. I believe it deserves it, and this is why. This is in recognition of an LCD display allowing patches to be named. I don't think anybody ever had that. I think Yamaha DX7 was the first, or those series of synthesizers. 16 voice polyphony and sound advancement that got us closer to the sound of acoustic instruments. The DX7 gave musicians a new sound canvas and new paint. Up next, 1984, not George Orwell, the Ensoniq Mirage in association with the Synclavier and the Fairlight. The Synclavier was introduced in 1977 and the Fairlight came out in 1979, but the Mirage was the first affordable sampler. 30,000 Mirages were made, 1,600 Synclaviers and 300 Fairlights. These are approximate figures and the best I could find on the internet. I want to be clear, the Synclavier and the Fairlight, and most notably the Synclavier, blazed the trail. There was probably little doubt in manufacturers' minds that sampling was going to be a thing. They just needed the state-of-the-art of technology to catch up to make it financially viable. Memory was crazy expensive, and so was processing power. The Mirage is only 8-bit with 32 kilohertz sampling and has only 128 kilobytes of RAM. My jaw dropped when I heard the Mirage, just as far as it had when I first heard the DX7. I recall playing a piano patch on it and thinking the DX7 had a real competitor. At $1,695, it was at least as affordable as a DX7. My observations at the time were that it had a tiny display of only 2 characters. The buttons were small and cheesy feeling, and the keyboard felt horrible. They later fixed that. Also, it took time to load sounds, whereas on my synths, you could just press a few buttons and you had new sounds. I couldn't see working musicians switching out discs and waiting. Still, it sounded real at an affordable price. Obviously, in the studio, load times wouldn't be an issue. If I remember correctly from reading Keyboard magazine back in the 80s, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis were on the cover, and they used a Mirage. They produced Janet Jackson. That's a pretty decent recommendation for the Mirage. When I would read Keyboard magazine about big-time musicians back in those days, some of them had synclaviers or Fairlights, but these instruments were the price of a house. I'm giving the Mirage an influential score of 85. I'm not sure it's fair to call the Mirage the tip of the spear, and that's why I included the synclavier and the Fairlight with it. Starting at that time in 1984, building up and reaching a peak, and then dying down around the year 2000, maybe a little later, hardware sampling was a big deal. It still is a big deal. We just do it with computers and products like Contact now. Famous composers were using racks of Roland S760s to mock up orchestral score. And even I was using 2 Roland S550s from around 1988 until the early 2000s. Next, 1984, 1985, and 1986. Originally, I had put these 4 synthesizers in the second list. I had stated that I was going to give them an honorable mention because I see these technologies as an answer to the dominating presence of the DX7 and FM synthesis, and not truly influential. I changed my mind and moved them to the primary list. One of the reasons for this is that the next synth on this list was also an answer to the DX7, albeit a major answer. I reevaluated and decided they should be on the primary list in the minor category. These 4 synths are the Prophet VS with vector synthesis, the ESQ1 and DW8000 with versions of wavetable synthesis, and the Casio CZ series using phase distortion. Some were more popular than others, but they prevented the DX7 from having a total stranglehold on the synthesizer market. Most manufacturers were jumping into sampling to combat the DX7. I'm going to score them collectively, and they earn a score of 45. Next, 1987, the Roland D50. Technology was advancing at a rapid rate in the 80s. This was pure genius by someone at Roland. They used a sampled attack transient glued onto a synth sustain or a tail. This has a lot of pluses and only one big minus. The pluses included more realistic sounds without the huge memory demands of a sampler, no load times, and now we're getting built-in effects at a higher quality than we've ever seen before. The D50 sold 200,000 units, and why not? It sounds great. Now the downside. Only a year later, another manufacturer launched the best-selling 61-note keyboard of all time. Still, the D50 had its day in the sun, and it's still sought after by many musicians. I give this synth a similar accolade as the DX7, that it has not been hyped beyond its true capabilities. It's still loved by many keyboardists, including me. It earns an influential score of 72. It earns this score for its innovation of sound production. Next, the keyboard that knocked the D50 out of the top spot in 1988, the Korg M1. More than a keyboard, the M1 was a workstation. Prices were coming down on memory, and Korg capitalized on that by making a sound set entirely of sampled sounds, but with none of the load time inconveniences. Add to that great onboard effects, a sequencer, and a fairly generous display, it sold 250,000 units. The M1 has 4 megabytes of sample ROM. Its retail price was around $2,800, but you could buy one new for about $2,200. The M1 gets an influential score of 90. It was the Rompler to beat. In 1990, Korg did it again. Having acquired some of the assets of the now defunct sequential circuits, Korg went to work, and the Wave Station was the product of that work. Unlike the M1, it wasn't a workstation, but it was a Rompler with a twist. Wave sequencing was a totally new method of generating sound by stringing together small audio samples to create ever-evolving pads and rhythmic sequences. Some people love it, some people hate it, some people say, whatever. Moreover, the combination of the effects and the sample wrong give it some of the warmest sounds I've ever heard on a digital synth. The original Wave Station was lacking piano and drum sounds, making it less of a choice as a first keyboard. The EX upgrade rectified this. I'm a huge fan of the Wave Station, but I need to keep that in check when I assign an influential score. Wave sequencing is very cool, but it's not as earth-shattering as FM. At least it wasn't to the industry. Also, the M1 steals a lot of the thunder for non-wave sequencing Rompler-based sounds. I'm giving the Wave Station an influential score of 72, the same score as the D50. For me, this is where the true giant steps of keyboard innovation ended. Everything from here on is baby steps of advancement, blending, recycling, or going retro. Let me outline some of that for you. We've had virtual analog. It's often associated with the Nord lead, but there are other keyboards that people cite as being first to market. We had a resurgence of real analog, albeit with some benefits of modern tech. This included big names from the 70s and 80s appearing on synthesizers again, like Moog and Dave Smith. With blending, you have an instrument like the Korg Kronos that includes many sound engines. But this is essentially a PC computer with a music keyboard in a portable package. We had retro with some companies making clones of classic synths or creating new ones based on previous tech. Clearly, they are advancements. They give musicians tools, but they're not influential. One innovation I've not talked about until now, and it's very important. That innovation is price. This is reflected in almost all manufacturers' products. Never have we been able to get such great tech at such reasonable prices. It's time for my second list. This is a list of keyboards that didn't make the influential list, and I want to say why. Some of these keyboards are iconic, but not what I would call influential based on the criteria I defined at the beginning of the episode. First up, Yamaha CS80. It's a remarkable synthesizer, but not an innovator and not influential. Can you name me just one soundtrack that the CS80 was used on? Did you just blurt out Blade Runner? Can you name me two? Okay, maybe you add to that Chariots of Fire. How about naming me 10? 10. I have a hard time naming 3. 10's practically impossible. It's an iconic synthesizer, but it's not influential. I feel like I need to talk a little bit more about the CS80 because it's loved by so many people. If the CS80 was an orange, I think Vangelis cut it in half and squeezed all the CS80 goodness out of it. He made that soundtrack based on all the good things about the CS80, and there's not maybe a lot left in there for anybody else to use in a marquee way. Next, analog and digital synths of the 80s. I'm going to group a bunch. Mini Moog, Memory Moog, Jupiter 6, Jupiter 8, OBXA, Chroma, SH-101, Juno 6, Juno 60, Juno 106, deal with it, CZ1, CZ5000, Poly 6, Poly 61, Poly 800, Mono Poly, Max, 6-track, Matrix 6, Wasp Nat, DX21, DX27, DX100, Emulator, AX80. I got a whole smattering of different manufacturers there. If I didn't name one that you're thinking of, I probably thought of it. And I can't name them all. It would just take a very long time to do so. If you think it was influential and it's something I haven't mentioned, post it in the comments with your reasoning for why it was a technological first leap forward or a sonic first leap forward. None of the synths I just mentioned were trendsetters in that they substantially advanced the state of the art in technology or the state of the art in sound. I grew up as a keyboardist during the 80s. It was truly a magical time. Living in Hallandale, Florida, my best friend and I were at Ace Music in Miami every Saturday. It was the largest music store in the city. We would also stop by Abe's Music just down the street. The keyboard area was isolated at the back of Ace Music. You had to slide open this big glass door that you might have seen that would lead from a house to a backyard. It seemed like something new was released every week back in the 80s. It was such an exciting time to be a keyboardist. Hopefully I haven't wasted your time. Take care, and I'll be back in another episode soon.